attendants and everyone else here. I want Mark, our first speaker, to start talking just casually to you guys about what he's here to do. And as he does that, you get this little wobble in the application to fix that. But I just want to get Mark talking. And I think, Mark, why don't you introduce yourself? Tell them the topic of what you're going to talk about, and maybe people might have some questions off the back. Okay. And that might be a good way to get it rolling. We'll try to keep this moving down and keep the information so it doesn't reverberate so much.
Thanks, Richard. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for coming. I'm really delighted to be here. Since we're not officially starting yet, I'll begin by talking a little bit about myself. I love to do that. I'm going to be talking today about some research I did about 15 years ago. And the thing I need to confess right away is I'm not a native Angelino. And before I started doing this work, I hadn't actually spent any time in Los Angeles. So I wanted to study LA in the early 20th century, and I got a hold of a map from 1917. And I said the best way to learn about the city from 100 years ago would be to study this map, and so I studied and I learned it really well. And then when I came up to LA, I knew exactly where to go, and I could sort of walk around and everything would be great, and all of a sudden there's this freeway in the middle of somewhere. I'd say, that was a problem, right? I had other problems. 15 years ago, technologically, it was really in the dark ages. We didn't have the internet yet operating as sorts of the database that we have now, and so when I was researching old newspapers, magazines, I'd have to go over to the old microfilm. The microfiche and sort of lean and crunch over like this, and you had these weird little strips that had a list of different topics you have to go look up and then order the microfiche, and it just took years and years and years to do that. And I didn't know Richard, I didn't know Kim, I didn't know a lot of other people who are much more intimately familiar with the LA landscape than I am. So I was really feeling kind of disadvantaged. So it's nice to be here today, talking to people who have a feeling they're going to be more familiar with the landscape of the region that I'm talking about than I am. And I always look forward to that because I can learn a little bit more. I'm supposed to be an expert on Los Angeles, but I'm constantly reminded every time I go to give a talk, because a lot of people know a lot more about the city than I do. So I'm hoping people can help me out when I start to stumble a little bit or have trouble remembering things. And maybe that will make this whole thing more enjoyable.
So what are you going to talk about today? Tell us your topic.
I'm going to talk about street speaking. I'm going to talk about this culture and practice that used to be rampant 100 years ago. And I think a lot of people are familiar with street speaking. If they consider it, they think about London's Hyde Park or maybe the Sandlot up in San Francisco.
Occupy?
Well, yeah, Occupy today. But if we're going back in history and sort of talking about the longer history of street speaking, perhaps people don't think about Los Angeles as much because, at least my perception growing up in San Francisco was that Los Angeles didn't have any streets. They had freeways. They had sort of suburbs with no sidewalks, but there weren't any streets. And so it was a great delight to discover when I started to research the city that actually LA had as vibrant and active street-speaking culture as any city in the world. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I'm going to talk about sort of the social and cultural context who participated in this. And I'm going to spend a lot of time discussing sort of the political implications. Street speaking became a tool for some of the radical movements in Los Angeles, starting at the turn of the century and up through the 1930s in the Communist Party. Street speaking really became a fraught public issue in Los Angeles. And so I'm going to be talking about that a little bit. And then I guess that's going to segue into Richard's film projection.
Can you define street?
Sure. The question was, what is street speaking? I'm talking about essentially the process of somebody addressing an audience in a public place. Usually doing this in a more or less informal context. So the classic term that they use for the time is soapboxing. You get a soapbox, you stand up and say, I want to talk to whoever is walking by. And we think about the late 19th century, this is a time when there is no radio, there is no television, no movies. When you think about all the people who are pouring into Los Angeles, people often coming without a lot of money, people settling in and around downtown in Skid Row, just coming off the trains, they're looking for a place to stay, they're looking for a job, they're out on the street. Street speaking was one of the few kinds of entertainments that was sort of available during that time. And so a lot of people participated in it or just watched it just as a way to pass the time. But it was also very much a way for people to participate in public life. Since you couldn't necessarily afford a newspaper, if you were just off the train, if you didn't feel that you otherwise had an avenue to sort of express your political opinion, well, pretty much anybody could go to the plaza, they could go to Pershing Square, they could just set up on 2nd and Los Angeles Street and they could start to voice their opinions and have arguments. And so that's really sort of what I'm talking about.
Was that why you started your research before you moved here, or what got you interested in it?
The question was what got me interested in LA. Yeah, that's a great question. The project itself was really looking at, let me back up and say how I got interested in it. I started my graduate work at UC San Diego in the mid-1990s. And as you guys all remember, at that time there was a lot of stuff going on politically in the state of California. We had the English Only Initiative, we had the ban on affirmative action that passed, we had a number of things having to do with the border, Operation Gatekeeper in 1993, concerns about immigrants, and lots of people in the state saying that we didn't want to accept certain kinds of people, the numbers that we had before. And in the midst of all this, somewhere around 1996, 1997, the census came out with an announcement that California had officially become a majority-minority state, that the percentage of white Californians had dropped below 50%. And in the media, you guys might remember, there was a big bunch of discussion about what this meant for the civic culture of California. And so I was thinking about this a lot when I was in grad school and trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And I decided that one way to sort of try to figure out what this all meant for California was to go back 100 years and look at communities that had experienced a similar degree of diversity at the time, and we're trying to figure out what it meant to live in a multi-ethnic community well before the state media started talking about it, and the national media started to talk about it. So I decided to do a project on neighborhoods in and around central LA, where literally, if you did a census, 1900, 1910, 1920, you could go down, let's say, boarding houses or apartment houses in and around here, and you would go down a hallway and there would be one Greek family, and one Japanese family, and one Mexican family. All these folks who are coming in from all over the world weren't used to this type of environment at all, or having to sort of make sense of it. And so street speaking became part of the larger study that was sort of wrapped up in this question of what did it mean to live in a multi-ethnic community for people who hadn't grown up there. I see Richard is sort of wandering around. I'm assuming that the sound is okay for everybody? No? You having trouble hearing me? Okay. Is that better? I'm not very good with microphones. I usually try to let my voice scared, but I don't think it will work this time. Well, maybe I'll just go ahead and get started. Is that all right, Kim?
Sure, absolutely.
I've already sort of talked a little bit about sort of the purpose.
Actually, I think Richard wants to do a formal introduction.
Oh, he does,
since he's
okay.
back. Would you like to give your introduction? It's 15:15.
Yeah, I just want to wait 2 more minutes. There's just a couple people in line.
But they're late. Make your introduction.
Okay, they're late. Okay, sorry.
Thank you.
I don't have any jokes or anything to tell about it.
Good man. Thank you. Okay. I want to thank everyone for coming. This is what number?
22, I think?
22?
Oh, it's Mach 2. It's 2A.
Okay, we used to do this at Clifton's. Clifton's closed. We don't talk about Clifton's. It's too much pain. We're back. It's a lot of pain. We're back. We were there the day they fired everyone. I know. 30-year employees. I know. I cried like it was terrible. Jonathan's family owns Figaro Bistro. They're the family behind this. End of December, Kim and I and Chippa came in for dinner because they just opened, and we said this is a great space. We'd like to bring our monthly salon back. Jonathan said yes. As I do now every year. Now that I'm 44, as I've done every year since I've been 40. every time I say I want to do something, I add a month to it. So I said, let's start in February. Let's start in February. So here we are. Hi, Mom. It's good to see you. Thank you for coming. So I want to thank everyone. We have 2 talks today. The salon, I think, used to have 3. We're going to make it 2. Mark Wilde, who you've already met, is going to come up and now get started properly on this talk about street speaking. This is so what's going to happen is he's going to talk for maybe half an hour, 40 minutes, and then we're all going to go into the dark room because Jonathan produced a projector, and I have my computer, and we have some photos. So we're going to look at photos of Communist Party rallies in Pershing Square in the 1930s, which Mark has never seen. And we're going to look at photos of rallies in the plaza. So it'll just be a nice way to bring home everything you're talking about. And then we'll have maybe a 5-10 minute break, and I will start my talk, which is going to be, and Gordon, you're going to help me. As much as you can. You're just going to be Gordon. All right. You're just going to be Gordon. We're going to do a projection of B-roll footage of Broadway from 1949. And we're basically going to walk through
6.
Thank you, 46. Thank you, darling. 46. And we're going to basically walk through this footage and just show you photos of buildings and talk about the businesses there. And then I'll pull out the city directory from 1970 and we'll look at the businesses on the same stretch of Broadway, basically 9th to 4th in 1970. I think that'll be a nice. So that's it. So Mark, are you ready to start this proper talk? We're very excited. Mark, how did we met because I read your book. And I emailed you. And then we got a lot of interest because we found the archives of the Union Rescue Mission. And I needed to talk to your advisor, Bill Devereaux. And you were very good at getting this getting his attention. We're going to the Hines in 3 weeks about that. Okay, so Mark, I want to thank you for coming. Let's take it away about the history of street speaking in Los Angeles, which, in light of the occupation of City Hall last year, is a very interesting and lively topic. And don't let me forget to tell my King Eddie story about 5th in Los Angeles and the 1908 law about anti-Boston.
Okay.
At the very end.
Great. Maybe you should just chime in.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Richard. I've already sort of given a bit of an introduction, but just for anybody who came in late, I'm going to talk about street speaking, and the point I was making earlier was that street speaking culture 100 years ago was very central, I think, to the lives of many Angelinos. If you imagine this city was one of the fastest growing cities in the world 100 years ago. People were pouring in off of trains, off of boats, driving in. However they could get to Los Angeles, they were settling here. Oftentimes people didn't have a lot of money, but settled in and around districts like the one we're in downtown. Right here, especially over by Skid Row down 5th Street, which of course was where a lot of at the end of that on Alameda was where a lot of the train stations were. You had a lot of people sort of moving along the streets who were interacting with each other, who were in a very sort of foreign and for them an unusual environment where they're encountering lots of different kinds of people that they hadn't seen before. And this is something that was happening in cities all over the world. So street speaking in the years before radio and television and movies and all those things became sort of a primary way for folks to communicate to each other. It was something that people would do, I think, informally and recreationally, where folks who felt like getting in a discussion or having an argument would sort of do it as a matter of course. It was also a prime mechanism for political campaigning or for moral campaigning. All the great evangelists of the period were accomplished public speakers, and many of them got their start on the soapbox, going up before sort of informal crowd. Politicians routinely would either rent out a vacant lot if they could afford to, or else just set up on a street corner and try to convince people to vote for them or to support a specific issue. So if you walk down the streets of LA 100 years ago, around here, if you walk down Brooklyn Avenue, now Suffragettes Avenue and Royal Heights, any number of another sort of major commercial areas of the city, chances are that you would see one or more or even several people engaged in this process of street speaking. And so I got interested in to sort of think about it as a kind of political culture, something that was central to people's lives, so something that for historians often gets lost because it wasn't recorded, because a lot of people who participated in it weren't necessarily civic leaders, and therefore it's kind of part of this hidden history of LA that I think was very important to people's lives, but wasn't necessarily something that's been covered a lot. So I'll talk a little bit about it, and then at the end I'll say why I think it's important to know about street speaking and what it can say about Los Angeles. Although street speaking took place all over the city, there really was sort of an epicenter of it. And the epicenter I like to think of was sort of a crescent-shaped area that on one side had Pershing Square, the other side had the plaza. Those two places were really the central place where you would go to hear street speakers if you wanted to, because as public spaces, they drew large crowds. They would cite rallies frequently, but also just informal kinds of presentations and addresses that people would give. Between those areas, if you sort of imagine sort of curling around to the central working class districts of Los Angeles, through Little Tokyo and Chinatown and Skid Row, there are also other places where people would set up soapboxes. There were certain corners that were known as kind of hot spots. 2nd and Los Angeles was a hot spot. 7th and Main was a hot spot. Pretty much anywhere on 5th Street was a hot spot. And so you have these different types of sort of cultures of activity that were known and were common and were places where people would go to participate. Lots of people loved this. They participated in it actively, and also, of course, drew some resistance. And so I thought, just as a way of describing what was happening, I read a couple letters, complaints that business owners would make when they went to the city council, or sometimes even filed a lawsuit to deal with street speakers. So this is one letter that was written by property owners on 3rd Street between Los Angeles and Main. That's how they identified themselves. And they registered an official complaint to the city council over soapboxes. They said that these street speakers are, I'm quoting here, indulge in loud, boisterous, and obscene speech, engage in acrimonious debate with each other and with persons passing along Main Street and 3rd Street. The sound and disturbance created by these meetings cause great annoyance and disturb the peace of the persons in the neighborhood. Large numbers of people congregate at these meetings and prevent the passage of traffic along 3rd Street, causing inconvenience to the public and causing vehicles to travel along the wrong side of the street. And this is the major sin, right? You're disrupting traffic, or you're already having problems with traffic in Los Angeles, and these street speakers were just sort of colonizing large areas of downtown. Here's another one. This is from a little later on. An attorney actually wrote this up to file an official complaint. These were business owners along 2nd and Los Angeles streets. He wrote, if anyone leaves his automobile parked near the curb on these blocks during the daytime, he noted, it is generally a matter of but a few minutes before the running board of the automobile will be converted into a bench, upon which will be seated loiterers and all forms of unemployed humanity. So we all got to go out and check our cars right now. So you have a sense of how people really felt entitled to some of these public spaces. They didn't mind blocking traffic, they didn't mind using people's cars. This was very much a sense of entitlement that people had as political participants, and it really sort of spread across a lot of different cultural communities. Pershing Square tended to have the more quote-unquote American. Did I just lose it? Is that bad? Yeah. Pershing Square tended to have, I feel like it's not working. It went down. Okay. If I just start yelling a little bit, will that work? No? Not going to hear? Okay. All right. Well, is that coming through at all? Okay. It suddenly went out of my ear. All right. Pershing Square and the plaza sort of had distinct kind of cultures that I think are sort of worth mentioning. Pershing Square, of course, was this central part of the quote-unquote American part of Los Angeles, downtown. The downtown that had been built up particularly to distinguish the city from its Spanish/Mexican origins. And then the plaza, of course, still represented the original settlement of the region and tended to attract a much more multi-ethnic and heavily Spanish-speaking clientele. So at a certain point in the 19-teens and 1920s, USC began to send a lot of students throughout the city to study different kinds of neighborhoods, and they would start to talk about some of these street-speaking cultures in and around Pershing Square, and the plaza. They would describe the plaza, one is very cosmopolitan, involving all kinds of people speaking on all kinds of subjects, and particularly had a strong culture of Spanish-speaking street speakers, many of whom were worried about the impending Mexican Revolution, or eventually the active Mexican Revolution. Many of them had been involved politically in one of the many factions that was participating in that. And then in Pershing Square you had a more sort of American slash American kind of audience, although again representing different people of different backgrounds and races who would often pontificate on domestic political issues. Transcending all of these distinctions, of course, were the religious speakers, the evangelicals, the evangelists, the temperance movement, the anti-prostitution movement. Los Angeles in the period was maintaining a sort of informal red vice district around Chinatown, so you had a lot of priests and ministers going into that area, holding public prayer meetings. The Salvation Army was causing all kinds of trouble and disrupting all kinds of traffic along these regions. So you had a lot of different kinds of speakers who were involved in this and doing the types of things that was upsetting these property owners. Around about the turn of the century, Los Angeles began to develop a small but rapidly growing socialist movement. And this was unusual, I think, for a lot of people because LA had a reputation as such a conservative town, at least in terms of its mainstream politics. But 1901, 1902, the Socialist Party began to establish a presence on the streets of Los Angeles and began to speak out in a more organized political way to lots of people who were coming in here, and especially the young and older men who were looking for work. And this is where street speaking began to acquire sort of a political charge in addition to the sort of social concerns that business owners might have. LAPD and civic leaders began to look at some of these speakers and become concerned as they started to gain larger followings, as the Socialist Party began to have some gains at the ballot box. And so starting in that decade, the city government and in sort of concert with the police department began to sort of crack down on the unregulated use of street speaking. They began to require a permitting process in order for people to have sort of organized meetings. They began to arrest people who violated this permanent process. As the Socialist Party grew stronger and stronger, they developed a policy of essentially arresting anybody speaking on the socialist platform. So this generated a kind of spectacle, I think it's fair to say, where the socialists figured out that the process of being shut down was in and itself a kind of demonstration. And so they would organize these street-speaking events where they would go out to a street like Broadway or Main Street frequently. Somebody would put down a soapbox, would get up and start speaking the socialist line. A cop would come down and arrest them. And as soon as that person stepped down, somebody else would step up and start speaking. And pretty soon they'd fill the paddy wagon, and you had a whole bunch of socialists going to jail while everybody was watching. Yeah.
Could you please elaborate on what the socialist line was and why that was such a problem for people?
Sure. The socialist platform at this time was beginning to talk about a widespread organization of labor against capital. They were beginning to challenge the open shop rules that sort of essentially prevented unionization in Los Angeles. And of course, the long-term sort of orthodox socialist platform was really workers, owners of business. So for a Los Angeles community that had a strong leadership, especially among the Los Angeles Times owners, the Otis family and the Chandler family, they really opposed this for a long time. These types of ideas were radical. And they seem to be sort of out of line for LA's culture. The socialist tradition up until this point had been much weaker than it had been, for instance, in San Francisco or New York, really a good part of the East Coast. But suddenly in the early 1900s, that started to change. And so that's why these folks were upset about it. And so street speaking began to sort of acquire a more charged atmosphere at this time. The socialists would sort of love the spectacle that this caused, and they started a sort of a tradition of using police repression as a spectacle to sort of dramatize their plight. They would talk about sort of deliberately doing this, and then when they got arrested, they would sort of issue these edicts from jail. They say, more people come on down and join us in jail via the soapbox. Go and get up and start talking, get arrested, we're going to flood the jails, and then everybody's going to realize that this is a more sort of serious type of activity.
Mark, I have to interrupt you. Who ordered a turkey sandwich with French fries? I'm sorry. Turkey sandwich with French fries. Okay. Downstairs. I don't know. Sorry. This is the best part. This is the best part. Bloody in the jail.
This happens in my class all the time. And so one of the things that sort of made it a little bit easier as a historian is as these arrests started to gain notoriety from the newspapers, you began to see at least some of the people who were getting arrested. And here's where I think the sort of multi-ethnic dimension of this street-speaking culture came in. The Socialist Party made overtures or made attempts to be multi-ethnic, racially inclusive, and to even include significant numbers of women as street speakers. It began to diversify, I think, to a greater extent than existed before, the kinds of folks who would get up and speak and participate actively in this process. And so you can see in the newspapers from the first decade of the 20th century, them arresting people from different ethnic immigrant backgrounds. There's a very prominent African-American preacher named George Washington Woodbey, who was by all accounts one of the best speakers, and by all accounts who received some of the worst abuse from the police. There were a number of women who would speak, often sort of couching their speech in the guise of being mothers and speaking on behalf of the family, but nevertheless getting up on streets and standing up and speaking and participating in this culture and generating a lot of response from the police. And the Socialist Party continued to gain power until the mayoral election of 1911, where they actually came fairly close to winning the mayor's seat. They captured a plurality in the primary, spooked a lot of the established interest in Los Angeles, and who eventually had to rally and develop a sort of working alliance between Democrats and Republicans to knock out Joe Harriman, the socialist candidate. This was a serious type of development for them. And when we start to talk about the ways in which mainstream interests would respond to that, they began to think in certain terms about street speaking as being one of the really sort of points of conflict that they had to address. So lots of these organizations began to develop their own street speaking network. They started by calling them Christian businessmen's meetings and speakers. They developed these speakers bureaus, and they would send people out onto the streets, usually dressed very nicely, and they would stand up and they would basically give the Republican line, the pro-business line, the free enterprise line, the anti-union line, and they would start to argue and fight with the socialist speakers or the radical speakers, the Wobblies or any of the other sort of left-wing groups that were in and around the area. And so this began to create a much more sort of dynamic and volatile type of atmosphere. Probably the best known of these pro-business groups was something called the Better America Federation, which was set up in 1917.
Don't forget Harry Holloman. Harry Holloman, Better America.
Okay, yeah. All right, so do you want to talk about Harry Holloman?
I do.
Yeah, okay.
How many people remember H.R. Holloman, Richard Nixon's chief of staff? That was his grandfather. Very bad guy. Lost his shirt in the C.C. Julian oil scandal in the early 1930s. Prominent member of the Los Angeles Athletic Club. We were just talking about Dana Bartlett and Garfield Brumley Oxnam yesterday. Two good men he drove out of town mercilessly. Richard Viguerie was Richard Nixon's PR guy, still has a blog. People attribute Viguerie as creating the modern right-wing politics, polarizing issues around race and class. Harry Holloman. Harry Holloman. Viguerie learned everything from Harry Holloman. He's a very bad man.
All right, thanks, Richard.
There's a sandwich downstairs that no one's claimed, and I can't figure out whose it is. I'm letting it go.
It's Harry Holloman's.
So groups like the Better America Federation sort of represented this conservative tradition that had enjoyed a lot of strength and a lot of sway in Los Angeles and Southern California more generally for a long time. Their speakers had a little bit of trouble, I think. They weren't really, they were used to sort of speaking in front of social groups and giving forums. Coming down to Skid Row or to Main Street was a little rougher for them. After they'd done it for a little while, some of them began to complain that they didn't like the sort of interactive nature of street speaking. They would prefer it if people would write down questions and submit them to be responded. Eventually, some of them began to ask for police protection. They thought that there were a few people who were not exactly friendly to them, and so as a kind of street level fight, the conservatives did not do very well on that area. The broader political landscape, of course, they did fairly well. But the concerns that were sort of raised by them were substantial enough that the city began, continued to crack down over the 1900s, the 19-teens, the 1920s, even as the socialist movement gave way to the Wobbly movement, a sort of much more radicalized version that was less popular and less influential overall, but probably more active on the streets, and then gave way to a nascent communist movement. The Los Angeles city government was looking at this, and they were seeing that street speaking was a problem, and so they began to establish a no speech zone in and around downtown. And it first began sort of around Pershing Square, quite predictably, and the sort of financial center of town that they just basically wanted to keep free of disruption. And over the years, it gradually expanded to incorporate more, sort of moved in this direction, I guess you could say, and up towards the plaza, began to stretch a little bit into Skid Row, began basically just to spread over time. And so by the time we get to the 1920s, the city government has effectively and in practice sort of outlawed street speaking in most of the areas that it was most likely to take place. And they did this in the name of national security. They had they got a big boost towards their argument during World War I, where there were some concerns for a while that the Germans might be trying to recruit Mexican and Japanese, ethnic Mexican and Japanese people on the West Coast for sort of fifth column activities. And they actually, the government actually sent some secret agents down to Pershing Square into the plaza who would sit around and they would spy or listen in on some of these conversations that took place, because they actually thought that they were going to catch German spies trying to recruit Mexicans and Japanese to sort of engage in sabotage or terrorism against the United States domestically. So it was a little kind of absurd that way, but it gives you a sense of the kinds of people who were coming to these areas and participating in these kinds of conversations. By the 1920s, street speaking had essentially been outlawed, functionally outlawed, even in many cases for evangelists, Christians who otherwise would not have sort of posed a threat to the social order. So I told you earlier that there were that some of these USC students began to sort of study this area, and so I'm going to read something just from one of the theses that they wrote about. This is sort of what had happened to street speaking by the time we got to the 1920s. This is a guy who's sort of sitting in on Pershing Square, and he says one can first hear men in quiet conversation. Voices are raised. Passers-by stop and listen. The crowd gathers. Words fly thick and fast. Antagonistic ideas clash. Convictions are expressed in angry tones. The crowd stirs about as it increases in size. The park officer, the police officer approaches. The crowd silently and suddenly scatters, only to form again as soon as the officer gets out of sight. So you have this sort of floating conversation taking place, oftentimes by people who were sort of habitués of these parks, who were sort of hanging out there to get some open air. And that's sort of what street speaking became in the 1920s. Until the very end of the decade, when the Great Depression hit, the October crash in 1929 threw many people out of work, and the Communist Party of Los Angeles, that had been existing for a number of years sort of under the radar for a long time, suddenly sort of seized on the new environment and the new challenges of the Great Depression to revive street speaking and political protest as a major sort of activity. And they did this by sort of capitalizing on the fact that with so many people out of work, there were even more people on the street, more people who were sort of free and available and willing to listen to people talk and hear ideas about what to do with what at the time was, of course, a very stressful economic situation. And so in my research, this is where I got to the point where I actually could get in touch with some people who were still alive. So I tracked down a number of former members of the Communist Party of the Los Angeles chapter. They were all women. They were all well into their 80s by this point. I don't think any of them was much over 5 feet tall. And I would talk to them. I'd sort of ask them about what they would do, how they do this, because the Communist Party, of course, also aspired to be multi-ethnic, multiracial, aspired not to make any real distinction between men's or women's roles in the party. That didn't quite work out that way in practice. But what these women would tell me is that they would set up a demonstration, oftentimes at the plaza, sometimes at Pershing Square. They would get started, and then the police would immediately come in and break it up and arrest everybody, as they had with the Socialists, as they had with everybody else. And as before, the communists saw this as a deliberate part of the process, part of the spectacle that they wanted to sort of create and demonstrate how the sort of working people of Los Angeles were being oppressed. And so I talked to these women about it, and I assumed what they were going to tell me was that, the men would do the speaking and they would sort of support things on the side. I was completely wrong about that. The women were up there speaking as much as the men. They got arrested as much as the men. They fought the police as much as the men. The first woman I spoke to was named Miriam Johnson, and she told me a story about the first demonstration she went to. One of the male members got up and on a soapbox. The cop pulled him down and started beating him up. And she said she pulled a hairpin out of her hair and went up and started stabbing the cop in the back of the neck. He turned around and in her words, knocked her out cold. That was her introduction to the meeting, and you can see how I think some of the violence really sort of became entrenched in this. Another woman, Dorothy Healy, who's really a major leader in the party, someone a lot of people have heard of, would tell me that the cops would carry these sort of switches, and when these young women, oftentimes in sort of dresses, some of them were still in high school, would go to these demonstrations, they would walk by and sort of slap the women on their bare legs even before they got started speaking. So there was a lot of violence that took place when this happened, but that's really what the communists wanted. Another woman, Mil Carlson, told me about one protest in Pershing Square where the cops set off a bunch of tear gas to try to flush them out because it had really gotten too big for them to arrest everybody. And they said the tear gas walked it all the way up to the Biltmore Hotel and forced the evacuation of the Biltmore Hotel. They thought that was spectacular. I mean, that was just the best thing that could have happened. So this was the type of people they were, just very, very tough people, spent a lot of time in prison, sort of cycled in and out of prison and go right back to street speaking. In 1934, some lawyers got a court injunction to prohibit the cops from breaking up meetings at the plaza. And one of the pictures that I'm going to show you when we move over to the back is sort of the big demonstration that took place after that ruling had been made. And you can see just all kinds of people there, all kinds of different faces, all kinds of languages and the signs that people are holding up. It was by most accounts for the communists a great victory. Paradoxically, I think, it also sort of marked the end of street speaking as a kind of useful technique, because once the cops stopped breaking everything up, some of the drama kind of got lost with that whole process of demonstration. And the next thing that happened was that the Communist Party, after 1935, moved into a new sort of strategy where they began to try to work with other kinds of organizations more. And so the confrontational nature of street speaking began to decline. So you can sort of see that. You can sort of see that picture. It kind of represents, I think, the very top, the high point of street speaking culture in Los Angeles. After that, things began to fade a little bit. When the communists stopped doing this, lots of the other kinds of street-speaking organizations did not pick up the slack. Of course, there were new kinds of media by this point. Evangelists could use the radio or increasingly TV. You had people like Amy Semple McPherson, who had a very public persona, but of course was taking advantage of all the technology and the growing Hollywood connections that you could have in LA to sort of spread their word around. So street-speaking began to sort of fall off a little bit. The Los Angeles Police Department began to sort of slowly but surely taper off and crack down on demonstrations. And by the end of the 1930s, they had sort of effectively outlawed street speaking again, this time without a lot of objections from political movements. And I found in my research, I found in my research a newspaper article from the Times in the late 1930s when a reporter who's sort of been covering some of these demonstrations for a while goes back. And by this point, the cops had sort of set up a rule that you could speak on Sunday mornings and afternoons at the plaza, but otherwise you weren't supposed to have any sort of organization. And so he went out and he looked at the culture that had sort of coalesced around this practice, and they did a lot of photographs of it. I wasn't able to get reproductions of it, but it's fascinating to see all the different kinds of people who are doing this. Some of them are lefties, some of them are evangelists, some of them are clearly a little touched in the head. The cops decided to end that practice too, with nary a peep of complaint, it appears, at least from the media or from any of the other leftist organizations that I was trying to follow. And so here's how Timothy Turner, this journalist, sort of wrote it.
Oh, Timothy Turner?
Yeah. Have you guys been talking about Timothy Turner?
Can I just...
Yeah.
I know that this is a great article. Okay.
Just because he wrote it.
Okay, so there are a couple things you should not forget. Do not forget Harry Holloman. Big, bad, terrible person. Do not forget Timothy J. Turner, Los Angeles Times columnist. Timothy Turner wrote a novel about Los Angeles, which is freely available on archive.org called Turn Off the Sunshine. Freely available. It's absolutely fantastic. He was in Mexico for the revolution. He covered the revolution for the LA Times. He came back up to Los Angeles. The 20s and 30s, he wrote a series of articles about lost 19th century Los Angeles for the Times. The guy's a genius. I know this article. This is a great article. You should all download a copy of his book, Turn Off the Sunshine. You can find it on archive.org. It's a series of vignettes just to let you know what you're missing if you don't read it. There's the story about the Mexican day laborer who grows his cannabis plants up and down Broadway. He plants them in pots and waters them, and the police don't know. And he makes his living by trimming them and selling his marijuana. And they're just great little stories about life on Broadway in the 30s and 40s.
Yeah, he was really one of the few LA Times journalists kind of had his ear, and he would tell some of these stories. Yeah, he told one about a young Japanese man who used to blow a trumpet at some of these free speech meetings, and then he told the story that there was a larger demonstration. The cops moved in through the crowd and beat him up, not because he was a radical, but just because he happened to be there. And then at the end of the story, he sort of comes out and he's not blowing his trumpet anymore, and it's a very sort of sad thing. And so those types of stories, I think, were in part what made Turner, anyway, not really mourn the loss of this sort of tradition. He said, small audiences have been hearing the speakers each Sunday, packing the sidewalks on the south and east sides of the plaza where the speakers lined up, the streets facing the curves. But he says, I'm paraphrasing here, but he says there's going to be little sympathy for this culture as it's existed now that LA has sort of outlawed the practice. It's perhaps just as well that the tradition be abolished, for the plazas should be all places of peaceful, for plazas should of all places be peaceful places of rest. And so Turner bid good night to this sort of culture of street speaking. And I thought I'd conclude just by mentioning a short story by another well-known observer of LA's social cultural life, Chester Hines. You want to talk about Chester? Everybody knows Chester Hines.
Not everyone knows Timothy J. Turner.
No,
everyone knows Chester Hines.
Chester Hines, of course, migrated to LA during the war. Wrote a couple of novels about sort of African American Los Angeles that became very important, not only to the study of Black history, but I think also to understanding the city's history more broadly. One of his short stories is called "Lunching at the Ritzmore," and it takes place on Pershing Square, and it involves one of these street-speaking conversations. This is wartime by this point, but it involves one of these sort of collections of people hanging out the square and get to talking. And there's a white college student and an older black man, and these two people make a bet, and the bet is the black man says none of the restaurants around Pershing Square will serve black people, and the white college student says that's nonsense, it's wartime, we don't discriminate anymore. And so they make a bet that they can go, whether they can go around and find a restaurant that will serve to the older black man. So other people are listening in on this. You know, it's Pershing Square, these are conversations, people come here to hear this stuff. A crowd sort of gathers and starts to follow him around, and more people sort of see what's happening, they begin to follow along, and pretty soon you have a couple of hundred folks, according to Chester Hines, marching up and down Pershing Square, looking around at different restaurants. Cops start to show up, and they're sort of looking at this, and they realize they can't really do anything because technically it's legal now, but they're following along to see what's going to happen. Finally, they go into what I guess is a stand-in for the Biltmore hotel and then the restaurant there. Everybody sits down at the restaurant. The cops are sort of standing there looking around. The wait staff at the Biltmore is sort of looking around and not knowing what to do. And so this whole group decides to order. Most of them can't read. And so everybody orders apple pie because that's the only thing that they can see somebody is eating. The whole group orders apple pie. The hotel serves everybody because they think the cops are there and watching them are going to bust them if they don't. The cops are waiting to see if the restaurant is going to refuse them. The young white college student wins the bet, but ends up having to pick up the tab because nobody else has any money. And so this, I think, is, in some ways, people think is sort of an elegy for this lost culture of street speaking and interaction that sort of took place. This sort of informal kind of process of learning and speaking and arguing that Hines sort of parodies so well. When we talk about Occupy Wall Street and some of the immigration rights protests that take place, we're in some sense looking at a sort of later generation of this sort of street-speaking culture. Having said that, I think that there's something different about that. I mean, the more recent kinds of demonstrations are much more organized, they're planned. You always let the police know you're coming, you mark out parade routes. It usually doesn't degenerate into violence, of course, not always, but usually these days there's a process by which that takes place. The stuff I'm talking about back in the early 20th century was much less orderly, much less efficient. People were much crazier. Pretty much anybody who would sort of go out and observe these street speakers said, you know, 7 out of 10 of them were off their rockers. They were just loony. But they also had a great appreciation for the sort of civic role that street speaking could play in American life, and they celebrated it as such. And that, I think, is one of the things that the city of Los Angeles, I think, has sort of struggled to reacquire. In some ways, that's why this sort of gathering right here is so wonderful, because this is the type of thing where perhaps 50, 7,500 years ago, I might have been the crazy guy standing up on the plaza. You guys might have been the folks out for an afternoon stroll or wanting to hear about the politics and things like that. There were many more kinds of opportunities for this type of event to take place. Now we rely on Richard and Kim to do all this work to get organized and put together all these great things. And so sometimes when I talk to my students about what this means for politics, we end up spending the last part of the conversation describing different ways of sort of recreating these types of conversations. Do you do it online? Do you use the radio? Do you use different types of things? How do we sort of recover this kind of conversation that used to be so much easier in some ways back then? So that's, yes? You got an answer?
They're more organized about, talking, promoting.
Repeat the question.
The question is, when did people sort of start to get more organized with their protests?
Yeah,
and
You were arrested in Berkeley in 64. What do you mean? It's my mother.
I went to Berkeley in the 60s with the first free speech movement, and we got arrested.
Oh yeah. Oh no, I think
and Mario Savio used to scream from the fountain, and I mean, it was, the police still came in and broke everything up.
Yeah, you're right. I'm sorry. I overgeneralized a bit. What I meant to say, I think, is that as downtown, the sort of centrality of downtown declined as a site of street speaking and public speech. You don't see as much around here.
Yeah, but it continued, right?
It did.
It continued. When did people get organized about it?
Well, that's a good. That's a good question, and I should point out that my dissertation ends in 1940, so I'm speculating a little bit here when I start going forward a little bit. But I imagine it was sometime after you got involved in the 1960s, and I think people began to realize that there were ways to use the streets that could essentially allow the cops to maintain a certain kind of order that they wanted to, and allow the protesters to maintain a certain kind of order. And I think a lot about the Occupy movement more recently. Not so much down here where things were sort of set up, but the one in Wall Street, where you basically had this dialogue going on all the time between the police officers about exactly how much of the space that the occupiers could use and how much of an egress they sort of had to have. Those types of discussions, I think, become more common in the 60s, 70s, and 80s as a lot of the organizations begin to think about the demonstrations a little bit differently, I think, than some of these earlier groups did.
I don't think it was very organized.
Okay. Point taken. Point taken.
I have a question and a comment, but my question is, you mentioned briefly about a demonstration and some altercations happened in 1934. I'm curious because of the gubernatorial election that year that almost saw Upton Sinclair win. What was the street-speaking culture in LA? How was that addressing that gubernatorial election? Was there more street speaking? Were there more crowds being drawn to it? Were there more altercations as a result of it, or was it business as usual?
Well, I think there was less because generally speaking, at least down and around downtown LA. And I should point out there are obviously different regions in Southern California where the timeline of this is different. San Pedro has a sort of big blow up in the 20s. San Diego has sort of an alternate trajectory for all of this. But at least around downtown LA, in the 1930s, the cops pretty much had a zero tolerance policy for anything that was leftist. And I should also point out that the communists I'm following right now, who are the ones who are really most deliberately violating this policy, they didn't necessarily think much of Upton Sinclair. That was too moderate for them. So they were not necessarily part of that alliance in 1934. It probably would have been if the election had taken place in 1935 or 6 after the international Comintern had sort of made this switch. To my knowledge, the Sinclair and the Epic people were not using street speaking that same way. They were having a success at the ballot box. They had the literature. They were having other sort of modes of communication that they were using.
Okay. The comment that I wanted to make was something that just came to me, having lived through some of that myself, was that after the war, especially in the 60s, you had, just like LA suburbanized, so did the street speaking. You had the pockets such as the Chicano Moratorium demonstrations in East LA, the Sunset Strip riots, the repeated riots there. You also had a lot of activity going on down in South Central. So there was stuff that was burgeoning out, but becoming more localized at the same time.
And then you had the campus.
What about
Yeah.
what about the 30s?
Nazis?
Yeah.
And some of the, there's a question about the Nazis. Can I just say something about the counterculture, because I've obviously offended people who grew up, you guys who are veterans. I don't mean to suggest that you guys are soft at all. If I was going to draw a distinction between what happened starting then and later and what happened before, was that the formality of it was a little bit different. The organization was a little bit different. There wasn't the casualness, the informality that the sort of luncheon at the Biltmore story sort of tried to emphasize. Of course, there was still conflict. Of course, there was still a lot of tear gas. And you guys are also right that you could say that the geography of it disperses a little bit, just like the geography of Los Angeles more generally was dispersing. There's also a question about the Nazis and whether they participated in street speaking. Is that? Nazis certainly made a public presence on the streets. My sense is that most of it was marching and not necessarily soapboxing the way we're talking about. One of the big regions in Los Angeles in the 20s that sort of had to endure the Nazi marching was Watts. interestingly enough. That was really the center point of I'm sorry, I misspoke. The Ku Klux Klan, excuse me. The Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s really sort of centered around Watts. In the 1930s, you had groups like the Silver Shirts and some of these other things that were organizing. A lot of them were sort of underground. They didn't want to maintain a public presence. They thought of their activities as being more subversive and underground, so they didn't necessarily try to draw up support on the street. And it wouldn't have been very safe for them to do that around here because the people they were trying to reach were really a minority of the street walking population by that point. So that would have been a tall order. Yes, sir.
In the 1970s at 7th and Broadway, almost all four corners would have like a doomsayer, Bible thumper person. Was that a remnant of the street speaking, or did that develop later?
The question is about the sort of Bible thumpers on 7th and Broadway. Is that what you was? So just right out here. Yeah. The short answer is I don't know. I haven't. As I said, I'm not a native Angelino. I didn't grow up here, so my studies ended during the war. I think what's fair to say is that by that period, the police weren't as concerned about street speaking anymore, and that while people would do it, you can tell me, but I'm guessing that these folks weren't drawing as big a crowd.
There were a lot of people on the street that would stop the road.
Yeah. Not disrupting traffic or generating a lot of followers. Yeah. Certainly, street speaking does not go away. I do think it starts to lose some of the relevance that it had before that. Some people, just if I can interrupt a second, some people do sort of point out that, of course, Billy Graham started his crusades in Los Angeles in 1949, and that did follow a tradition of actually renting a vacant lot. I think it was Washington and Hill.
Yeah,
right.
There's a plaque there.
Yeah.
There's a plaque there.
In front of traffic court.
Yeah. So not really in downtown, but this was another sort of way to have sort of a quasi street speaking meeting where it's actually private land, but it's just open to the street and anybody is allowed in.
I grew up on Bunker Hill in the late 40s and the 1950s, and they were sort of amateur evangelists that would stand up on the corner and were largely ignored.
Okay. All right, so again, the street speaking, you're right, it continues all the way through the 40s and 50s. Yeah, okay.
I think, if I could make an Australian observation, street speaking probably continued in Australia until very recently. It might still be there in the Domain on the Yarra Bank. Leftist street speaking went right up.
Still part of it.
Still there today, isn't it?
Yeah.
And how's that working out for them?
No, they don't get many people.
It's a tourist.
They get wandering trade, passing trade.
Cal State LA.
I think what I want to do is I want to set up the projector, which will take just a minute because I'm using the power cord for the microphone that I need for my. We'll be okay. What I'd like to do, because you have photos, and we have some really interesting photos. We're going to break the focus. We're going to move to the other part of the room where the projector is going to be, and if you'll just do what you need to do. But in about 5 minutes, we'll show 3 photos you have from the plaza from the 30s, and I have 6 photos from Communist Party rallies in Pershing Square from the 30s. And I assure you, these are fantastic photos. Yes, if you could grab your chair, that would be, and it's just right over there, and we'll move, and we're going to stay there because my talk is a projection too. So we'll just segment the projection. Mark, everyone, Mark. I know